all sorts of different vulnerabilities that are associated with groups of people, street drinking, and I mean, we're going to come on to things like information sharing and intelligence later on, but we are finding that through improving intelligence gathering and sharing of information and what have you, there are links into all sorts of other areas, more serious crime, things like gangs and drug dealing, but also things like child sexual exploitation. You know, they're people who are on our offender management cohort, etc. So street drinking is a big, complex area for us. The other area that I would highlight as a specific issue is around mopeds, and that's related to both sort of antisocial behaviour, riding mopeds in parks and through estates and what have you, but there's also a connection there to robbery and more serious crime as well.
That's where I say where antisocial behaviour then spins into other criminality.
Yeah.
I mean, Natasha, when you were doing the work around the police and crime plan and going out to the boroughs, what sort of responses will you get in that context?
Echoed much of what's been said here today. So from both ends, in terms of what local partners were telling us, that, you know, fly tipping, noise nuisance, but also some of those higher end concerning issues like moped enabled crime and the nuisance that causes to people. And also from the public, people were telling us, you know, about 10% of people who come back through our surveys tell us they've been a victim of ASB, so it is a concern to people in the local area. And they were more likely picking up things like drug dealing and the kind of nuisance and concern that causes in communities.
And did you see a variable across London, from in or out of London?
There does tend to be a variation. I think, you know, with more sort of environmental and noise nuisance happening in some of the outer London, and then more concerns about things like drug dealing and higher end issues in inner London. And I think that's a matter of the context in which those people are living in those boroughs and the other things that happen there.
Okay, that's really helpful. I touched on a point around call to the Met, because much of the information that we have, statistics we have, are based on call to the Met, which, from the evidence that we gathered earlier, can tend to skew the actual picture, and housing associations particularly talked about that. So really what I wanted to talk about is the antisocial behaviour data that others get, so because we've got the Met information, so others being particularly the boroughs, perhaps yourself in Parkgard. So can we just have a debate particularly about that, Andy, about the Met information, but also the information that you garner through other partners and how you work around that?
Yeah, so I mean, information comes into the local authority in lots of different ways. We're kind of quite complex organisations and often have many different sort of data sets. I mean, the obvious ones that we look at are things like, you know, the internal antisocial behaviour team and the number of cases and reports and what have you that come in. Lots of useful information from housing. You know, working very closely with things like tenancy officers and things like that. Responsibility for noise, so we can look at lots of information around noise. So, as well as looking at information in things like youth offending services and you know, outreach teams and things like that. So there are multiple different ways in which that information comes in. So it's not necessarily straightforward to really get to the bottom of what it's telling us. So it does require effort and analysis to kind of you know, make meaningful you know, get meaningful action out of it.
So how does that sit with you, Shirley, in Brent? Data gathering, how does it work in your
We're very fortunate in Brent, as we've got a senior crime analyst within our team, and he looks at all data from the Met and also coming into the local authority as an organisation from the areas that Andy mentioned, but also from adult social care and our mental health colleagues. So we gather a lot of information that way. What I would say is we find that there is a gap in the Met data, not a gap so much as an inaccuracy around CAD calls, that they don't identify specifically where a situation's taken place. So, for example, we have the Harrow Road that runs all the way from Harrow right into town, and so it's hard for us. We create hotspots on the calls that we get from the Met, and that helps us to target our certain areas and identify what's going on.
And the housing associations, you have a relationship with those gathering information as well? Yeah,
Our own arm's length association provides most of the information. Right. The others are quite good but it's not on anywhere near on the same level.
Okay, right. Lee, did you want to add to anything that we've talked about so far?
Yeah, I mean, we work across quite a few different boroughs, and what we find is that the degree of data that's collated is very, very inconsistent. And it's not just from borough to borough, it's also within boroughs as well. I think with the way that our system works, there's a lot of focus on doing the things that are filling the gaps within what everyone else collates in order to enable other agencies to operate and to take further enforcement action. So our focus has always been very much on evidencing the impact, because we're not emergency call driven. It means we have time to sit and actually record a much broader range of data. So I think there's a lot more work to be done around the level to which people record information and trying to get a more standardised model across the borough, because that and ultimately is what the police then action, or the community safety units then take that civil enforcement action against persistent repeat offenders.
Okay. I mean, lastly, on data, I mentioned earlier that there is a reliance quite properly on Met data that we supply, which is, we can comment on that, and that Met data suggests that a recorded ASB was in decline over a period of years, but has seen a spike coming up over the last 12 or so months. But that is dictated by your data, which is the predominant data. Does that trend, is that reflected in either MOPAC or Borough's data as well? Is that reflected there as well?
Yes, it is,
Would you
yeah.
agree? Yeah.
I spoke to our crime analyst and he said we mirror that in
Right.
print.
Just for context, we get about 150,000 calls a year. We record 75,000 antisocial behaviour incidents on our system called Airspace. And that number is about half as it was, say, 2010 and 11. So there has been a very strong downward trend. As you say, in the last 12 months it's gone up, but in fact it's coming down since May. So I wish we knew why, but we don't. There's seasonal peaks in the summer months.
But we find out from Andy, but until you find out why, you can't really address it. Until you get the full picture, you can't address it. And the critique that's come out is there's no reliance on clearly your figures, which are the majority for the teams, but clearly people reporting ASB in other mediums that may not get referred. Andy, you're about to comment on that, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the data in Croydon reflects what you've highlighted, Steve, in terms of a dip and then a small spike. But I wanted to make a slightly different point, which is about just being cautious about what it's telling us, I think, because I'm going to give a particular example. I was at a community meeting a few weeks ago in Croydon, where there were lots and lots of anxiety about antisocial behaviour going on around a park. But actually, when you look at the analysis, there were virtually no calls about that at all, either on police or council systems. And the feeling from the community was, well, what's the point in reporting it? You're not going to do anything about it. So a lot of the meeting was about trying to build up that confidence and trying to get people to report it, because unless people do report it, we don't know about it and we're not necessarily going to act upon it. So there is a confidence issue here, I think, in terms of making sure that that people are reporting issues, and that then gives you a more accurate picture in terms of what's going on.
And sorry.
I mean, I would say that that sort of overt behaviour, I would expect the dedicated ward officers and PCSOs to be aware of it, whether or not it was reported, and then try and solve that as a problem.
Okay, thanks for that. Right, we're now moving on to, and we've already touched upon it, the definition of antisocial behaviour and talking about support to victims. We had some evidence, particularly from David Miller, Hammersmith and Fulham Safe and Neighbourhood Board. His comment, and David always has good comments, is one person's antisocial behaviour is another person's minor annoyance. So it's this perception issue. But we've got some questions about Peter. I think you're leading on.
I was just about to ask that.
There, I trumped you. There you go. But carry on anyway.
Good morning. Do you agree that we need another definition or a definition of antisocial behaviour in London? I mean, I'm looking at the background, and obviously it seems that there are two acts in play. You know, there's a 2013 Act, 2014 Act. And they do, it seems to be pretty amorphous. I mean, what is your view? Do you think that we should tighten the definition, widen the definition? I want to ask you all, actually. Maybe Natasha?
I think from my point of view, I mean, the definition is broad, and I can understand why that perhaps feels amorphous. But I think that's helpful in some respects, because as we've discussed today, ASB is such a broad range of things that could be ASB, and one person's ASB is not another's, for instance, that actually if you tried to be really specific, you might end up excluding things that you would want to be included. You know, you couldn't have an exhaustive list. I think that would be difficult. And I think what the definition does do is speak to the point about the harm, you know, the harassment, alarm, distress, which is actually a really important factor in that too. So from my point of view, I think a broad definition is helpful. But within that, obviously, being able to break that down, for instance, in the way the Met has, by understanding, you know, some of it is personal, some of it's environmental, and some of it's about that wider community impact, does help to give you some categorisation, which I think you do need at some level.
Doesn't it make your jobs even more difficult? I mean, the thing is, what it seems to me, I'd be interested to know, because just looking at it as a layman, on the one hand, you know, you talked about open drug dealing, for example. I mean, to most people, that would be just a crime, no, and not antisocial behaviour. I don't know, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got a lack of clarity, maybe, or understanding by the public, so that you have those who suffer in silence because they don't want to add to the burden of the police, when in fact they are experiencing either non-crime antisocial behaviour or actually crime. And then you've got, on the other hand, those who are reporting every time they hear a twig break. And it's getting a sort of common understanding about how people and when they should report, so that we understand, because it's about their impact, the impact on the quality of their lives, and it's about the nuisance and annoyance and the harassment that they're suffering locally. And that sort of threshold that, yes, it's actually not crime, it's everything that's below crime that is causing them to be alarmed and distressed and impacting on them. And I think that is not clear to the public. You know, the legal definitions, as you say, are wide. It's not helpful sometimes, as Natasha said, I agree, to start trying to define that further for professionals, because that can lead to a bit of silo and remit sort of culture. But I think for the public, an educational process would be a useful exercise.
Can I just comment? I think, although in some ways it doesn't actually matter to me, but that the public may not be able to classify something as either a crime or antisocial behaviour. The public call the police, for example, because there's an incident of concern. So if they phone up and say, look, I'm really concerned because people are smoking cannabis in the local playground and I can't send my children there, you've both got a crime and there's an antisocial issue. And they'll tell us, and we would then deal with that problem. So in some ways, I think the nuances of their understanding doesn't actually matter, as long as it sort of reached a threshold for that individual for them to pick up the phone and call one of the agencies, probably the police.
I mean, do you think, I mean, what is your view on the rough sleeping aspect? I mean, for many people, I mean, is that antisocial behaviour? That comes under a definition at the moment of antisocial behaviour. Do you think it should remain under that? This is a social problem, isn't it? Is it actually an antisocial problem?
I think it's not the rough sleeping itself, it's whether there's antisocial behaviour accompanying it. So you can have people who obviously, who are rough sleeping, causing, you know, they're not causing direct issues to anyone else. And then there are others who are then involved, and there may be associated issues, whether it's through drink or drugs or just behavioural issues. Mm-hmm. So I know that it's not, you know, as simple as just sort of saying homelessness, whether it's in or out. It is, there is antisocial behaviour associated with some people who are homeless and rough sleeping, not with all, and therefore they, you know, having some legislation or some tools to tackle that. So I know that, you know, officers and partners work together closely, and they will go down the preventative route and diversionary route. But there are some who willfully, you know, want to stay on the streets, and they are impacting on the quality of lives and frightening people. And having some legislation and tools, effective tools, is useful in that regard.
Could you give me a definition as well on the definitions? We've got personal antisocial behaviour towards an individual. Could you give me an example of that, actually? What would an example of that be for the purposes of our definition?
I suppose somebody, children deliberately targeting a vulnerable person in their home by persistently banging on their door or kicking a ball directly at their window. So it's specific to an individual, and that's obviously the ones of real concern, or more, greatest concern to us.
So do I take it, therefore, that with the definition that stands at the moment, you're all happy with that definition?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, right. I mean, when it comes to the response to antisocial behaviour, you know, do you think that there's a chance that people fall between the different gaps at the moment because it is so broad that...
I think one of the issues is information sharing this week, because
Yeah.
it's a challenge for us, probably for all the agencies. And I think that when we get together as partners and try to solve a particular problem and do share the information, the response is obviously significantly better than if we work in isolation.
How do you actually support the victims? Can I ask you how you actually support the victims at the moment, victims of antisocial behaviour in all its forms?
Well, all the victims of the 75,000 reports are assessed for their vulnerability. So there's a victim-centred approach to the investigation of the antisocial behaviour from the outset. So I suppose that's the starting point. And then depending on the number of calls, if there's a repeat caller, about 6,500 of the number that we record are from repeat callers. And of course, the reason why somebody would make calls several times could be varied, often associated with mental health, but not always. But of course, and those types of people have got a real concern. I mean, there's a big demand pressure on the police and other agencies if they persistently call. So we're doing quite a lot of work, particularly around repeat callers.
I see. Can I, just to examples clarify things. So, for example, if I'm in my flat and there's just someone who keeps having, you know, night-long parties or something in the block, really noisy, I call you. What do you do then with me?
Probably the local authority would take the lead on that.
But if it's directed against the individual, what we do, every report has a standard risk assessment, which is across all of London, and you go through the set number of questions. It asks all the things that should be asked, and it comes out as either a low, medium or a high risk. If it's a high risk case, that goes to the duty inspector for immediate action. If it's considered that maybe a partnership response within a day or two is more appropriate, then people work in partnership and do it that way. Sometimes it may just be, well, let's send the Safer Neighbourhood team round the next day. But every borough in London, in our grip and pace rooms, we talk about having partnership vulnerability desks. It's a neighbourhood officer. They're looking at the antisocial behaviour cases. They are helping in the first instance to assess the vulnerability. So if an officer hasn't been sent direct by METCC, a response team officer, then our vulnerability desk are looking at those cases, often calling those people, speaking to them, assessing what the quick time risks are. Should something be done now? Can it wait for the Safer Neighbourhood team later on? And further down the track, all the Safer Neighbourhood teams are expected to work in partnership. So whichever appropriate authority they should be working, whether it's adult social care, mental health services, or housing agencies, at that point we expect the partnership approach to take over.
Can I just ask, you know, quite recently the Deputy Commissioner, Craig McKinley, BBC Health, said that the police are going to kind of start prioritising, or, you know, people that they answer calls to. This is to do with crime. Does that affect you too? Would you start prioritising different groups, call out?
I think, as Nick said, I mean, the severity assessment of the risk, the higher the risk, they would
No,
affect
but this
the
was
approach.
specifically like different groups, older people, people who didn't speak English, blah, blah, blah. It caused a lot of fuss in the press. Does that include the way that you would do it in your response to it?
There's no reason why it shouldn't.
No reason why it shouldn't?
Why it shouldn't, but I mean, at the moment, age, for example, would be one of the factors.
Okay. What kind of training do your people then get, you know, in this particular context? What, you know, these are very, very complex issues, aren't they?
Yes.
They're incredibly wide.
Yes.
So what kind of training do they get?
Well, I think this is a very positive, actually, because the Met at the moment are in the process of putting 2 dedicated constables per 629 wards in London, plus police community support officers. So we have dedicated officers, and those dedicated officers are in the process of being trained on a number of modules, including community engagement, crime prevention, specifically on antisocial behaviour. But in addition to that, and they will have already have done computer-based training on the legislative side of antisocial behaviour, but we're in the middle of a widespread antisocial behaviour training course and problem-solving approach to their role.
I see. I just wanted to reconfirm, you were saying that when it comes to support of victims who call you antisocial behaviour, your approach would be roughly the same as what the Deputy Commissioner recently said about crime generally?
Yes.
There'd be certain groups that you would prioritise?
Yes.
Could I add something, Mr. Woodward? Just to come back to your original question about what kind of support services are available, the other thing I should just add that is that where it meets the criminal threshold, there are obviously commission services that we commission as the Police and Crime Commissioner for victims of crime. And they would be asked by the police officer if they wanted a referral into those support services, and if they did, they would be referred to victim support, who I know came to your last session, for additional kind of emotional and practical support for them in dealing with the crime associated with this, if there was one.
Thank you.
Can I just make a further point, which is not about victims necessarily, but about witnesses, and because I think that is probably an area that we could look at and do more for. We very much rely on witnesses to provide information to us in order for us to take action against perpetrators. We try and support them as much as we can, but often people are very reluctant to come forward and stick their neck out and give us the information. But it's some of that aftercare support that's required as well after a case has gone through the system, particularly if there's no further action or the case has fallen down for some reason. I think we do need to be more mindful about the sort of the support that we can give to witnesses moving forward.
I'm just a little bit alarmed about this prioritising, actually.
I think the main.
I'm very alarmed about it.
I would just add that we're in the business of trying to manage harm, risk, and threat to the community. So the balance is about identifying that risk to people, whilst actually acknowledging that there's pressures and stretches on the resources of the Met and all our partners at the moment. So on one hand, we've done some analysis and seen that there's perhaps been a lot of unnecessary calls that have come into Met CC. We've also seen response teams get deployed constantly to a lot of calls that they shouldn't have been deployed to at times when we can't really afford to do that. And then the other side is making sure we identify when there's a really good, genuine, risky call and someone is vulnerable and they do need help today, that we identify. It's getting the balance right, and that's a challenge going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Yesterday, on that point, Susan and I were at LAS, the ambulance service, and they deploy, we were sitting with their call holders, they deploy a filtering system of judging the risk and how they handle that immediate risk, whether it's an immediate loss of life. So, let me continue. But going back to that, however, that it is of some concern, because we heard Craig's comments last week. The comfort I would get from this is the extra ward officer. So in every single ward, you've got 2 DWOs, PCSO, and you'd expect them to understand the vulnerabilities in their ward, to understand the families that are particularly at risk, and do some work around that with the local authorities. But I share Peter's concerns around that.
There's a difference here, isn't there? Trying to assess the risk of someone who says, my rabbit's up the tree and it won't come down, please come and help me. I mean, we can all assess that risk, right? But I think that the very troubling thing which really worried people, quite understandably, and it does have a bearing here, is this idea that certain groups would be prioritised in actual response to the police in all areas to call out. I mean, whoever thought of telling him to say that, it's unbelievable, frankly.
I don't quite understand what the issue is, because surely if somebody phones up and they're elderly, or they're suffering from a mental illness, or they're a child, the response is going to be different because of they're extra vulnerable. I don't see what the problem is about this part of the overall assessment. I don't understand your concern.
Well, no, just simply that the law should be enforced whatever.
Pardon?
The law should be enforced whatever. So
It
my
is.
call should be
It is,
exactly
but
the same.
it's according to need. It's not one size fits all. The greater, the more vulnerable the person, you'd expect a speedier and a fuller response, wouldn't you?
Well, what would you say is more vulnerable?
I've given several examples. Somebody with a mental illness, somebody who's very elderly, or a child on their own, for example.
But it's someone who doesn't speak English, for example. Is that vulnerable?
I think we understand the point that you're made, and I understand it, and I understand that this is semi-philosophical. And the point has been made well, Peter, and it's been registered, and I think Julian, you have tried to answer. You have answered it.
I hope so. It's according to the needs of the individual. The greater the need, and it could include that they are more vulnerable because of a particular characteristic. That's the point.
Okay. I don't think people would necessarily completely argue with that. Shirley,
In my experience, quite often the
help
victims,
us on this, Shirley.
the victims are selected as victims because they're vulnerable. That's why they are victims. That's how they're targeted.
Yes.
And in Brent, the way that we help victims is if somebody has a vulnerability, and again, it would be mental health, physical disability, learning disability, you know, anything like that that draws attention of perpetrators and has made them vulnerable, we would assess that, and they would come to the community MARAC. And the support that they would get is that they would have a full and holistic assessment by a multi-agency group to check that they're engaging with mental health, they have a social worker, their benefits are in order, their property, you know, is suitable, and we would do all of those sort of checks. And quite often they have disengaged from all of that, and that's what's made them vulnerable. So when they become a victim and they come into the process, we assess all of that on behalf of the victim and get it all in place as quickly as possible. And that is bringing the victim back into, the needs of the victim back into the middle of the picture.
Thank you. Right, on the subject of victims, unless you have a question about the Commission.
A couple of questions, Chair. Thank you. The Mayor has just appointed a Victims Commissioner who I met recently. Can I just ask you, I'm starting off with you, Ms. Plummer, how do you see her working in this particular area of victim support?
The role of the Victims Commissioner obviously is to bring the voice of the victim back into the heart of everything that we do. There is a particular emphasis in that in terms of how we work with the criminal justice system, so she does have a strong emphasis in that space, and we'll be conducting a review of things like compliance with the Victims Code of Practice, and also a needs assessment which will look at the types of services that we need to be providing for victims in London. Now there is quite a strong emphasis on that in relation to victims of crime, because that's kind of what we're funded to deliver in terms of Ministry of Justice, and we have a strong focus there. But I have no doubt that through the work that we do around the needs assessment, we will bring forward concerns about victims who fall outside of that threshold, particularly in terms of the ASB space, which we've already talked about today, and we will be looking at what that tells us in terms of that needs assessment and thinking about what more we need to do in that space with partners. She will absolutely be a champion for victims, and she's looking at how she brings that voice in, and also thinking about how we are funded to deliver those services for victims. And we've certainly been lobbying the Ministry of Justice and Government to look at the definitions around the funding criteria, which actually exclude us from supporting victims of ASB who are not victims of crime. So she will be picking up that point also.
I mean, you talk about funding, and as I understand it, there's going to be a 3-year, £47 million investment programme.
Yes.
Can you give this committee an idea of how this money is sort of going to be spent? I'm more concerned about how it actually gets to people on the ground.
Yes, so that will...
And I've given my thoughts to the Commissioner about how I see, what I see of her role.
Yes, so
essentially working with local councils at the grassroots level.
There are a number of things. So that particular funding relates to services that we will be commissioning from here in City Hall. So our multi-crime service that supports all victims of crime, but also a number of specialist services. So things like rape crisis, havens for victims of sexual violence, services for victims of hate crime, and services for children and young people who are victimised. But in addition to that, of course, we do also have our London Crime Prevention Fund, which we give out to local authorities who can spend that on their local priorities as they see fit. And some of them are indeed spending that on work that relates to antisocial behaviour, which is one of their priority areas. And about £4.4 million over the next 2 years will be spent, particularly through the London Crime Prevention Fund, on antisocial behaviour.
Do any of you want to come in terms of your thoughts of the Victims Commissioner? No. But can I then move on to, well, I'll invite all of you to come in here in terms of what specifically can be done to support victims and who should provide it. And I'm looking here for sort of good concrete examples. We've talked about causes and definitions and so on, but I now want to focus much more on the practicalities. So, to all of you, what more do you think can be done that's not being done right now to support victims, and who should provide it?
I So I think there's been a strong emphasis in the discussions today about the multi-agency nature of this work. So actually, you need lots of people to be working in this space and providing support in different ways, and indeed they do. Clearly, we are obviously providing funding and support in terms of victims of crime specifically, and also for those wider victimisation issues through the London Crime Prevention Fund. But you will need other agencies, so the police obviously are providing support, and other parts of local authority services will be providing support in all sorts of ways. You know, antisocial behaviour is a complex issue, and often the people who are victimised, and indeed the people who are perpetrating, have complex needs and things that need to be dealt with and addressed. You absolutely need a multi-agency response that tries to address all of those issues.
Yeah. Can I say, Mareks were mentioned, the multi-agency risk assessment conference, and representation is at the right level, and I find them particularly effective once it gets to that level and the partners work together. That's when it can really work.
Just to point out, the community Mareks are probably in 2/3 of the boroughs of London. All the others have partnership antisocial behaviour meetings, and the challenge there is making sure that, yes, it's at the right level so that all agencies are doing their bit. The important bit is it's often the discussions centre around who's actually the best place to impact and support the victim, and it can be different agencies depending to each case. You've got your sort of generic victim support scheme, and yes, different boroughs have had victim champions providing support. So it's done on a case-by-case basis, and it's just making sure that all the boroughs are regularly meeting. Normally it's at least every month. Sometimes they're meeting more frequently if a case requires it, and it's just about reviewing that case and seeing who's best placed to support the victim.
I'd just like to echo that exactly. The importance of these kind of community multi-agency meetings are a key. Doing that risk assessment at an early stage, but for both victims and perpetrators. Don't forget that at the point that Natasha made, that a lot of the perpetrators that are doing this are vulnerable and have very complex needs as well. Sharing that information and really trying to find out who is the best place to actually deal with this, whether it's a bit of carrot or stick, is incredibly important to actually try and manage these issues. So nothing specific to add, really, just to echo what colleagues have said.
I would just like to add, I do think that once victims and vulnerable people are identified, I think the support package, it's been in our experience where we've worked, that is actually quite good. And the targeted work around individuals to support them is actually very good. I think where the weaker area is actually the early identification, and actually having people out on the ground who recognise signs and identify people that haven't actually come to notice yet, especially in areas where you see a lot of regeneration projects and things like that. There's often a lot of people that actually haven't come to notice, and the only way that you identify those people is through actually having a consistent person out and about to meet the community, understand what the needs are, and actually identify those people and what their vulnerabilities are.
So can I come back? I think both you, Ms. Plummer, and Mr. Opie, if I heard you correctly, you talked about perpetrators having complex needs. Am I right?
Yes.
I mean, what are these complex needs? I mean, the part of London that I represent, say, noisy parties, nighttime parties, but people, not necessarily on council estates, but live a miserable life with music being played at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, street drinking. So give an example. What are these complex needs that perpetrators have?
An example
Because I don't think that people who suffer from antisocial behaviour see it the way that you see it.
Okay, Ed, I could give you a specific example that is kind of, that we've experienced in my borough, which is around sort of street drinking and antisocial behaviour in a local park. A group of people, street drinkers may be alcoholic, they may be drug users, so they have that kind of vulnerability, as well as things like housing issues, mental health issues. But actually, within the wider group of people who are associating with this group, we've identified people who are missing from local authority care, people who are at risk of child sexual exploitation, and other things as well. So the picture of information sharing and data gathering is not straightforward. It's not just about going to 1 or 2 different agencies. You really need to have a you know, a good network of contacts and access to information to really understand what's going on. Because it's not necessarily up to the police or one of my antisocial behaviour team to go and deal with an individual who's at risk of child sex exploitation. That may well be their social worker, or it may be someone else, in terms of going in with a slightly different approach. So you really need to analyse each particular issue and find the best approach to them.
Well, I don't want to labour this, Tim Chair, but let me come back to street drinking, because I'm glad you mentioned it earlier, Mr. Opie, because that is one thing that Ms. Holmes didn't mention, street drinking, which is a particular issue in parts of East London. But I'm not saying the connection, there is some sort of connection to betting shops, for instance, in local high streets. People bet, come outside. I've tried over the years, we try to get the betting shops to take some social responsibility, but that's another story. And part of our diverse communities, street drinking is actually seen as a cultural thing. You just go down Eastham High Street, and I was actually talking to Newham's Director of Enforcement yesterday about this. It's actually seen as basically part of day-to-day life, using the local bin as a bar, but especially with the weather that we've had recently, well, not now. So, I mean, that's the sort of day-to-day stuff that I'm more concerned about. So I really accept that there are complex issues, especially with people with mental health and so on. But I think we need to sort of be much more robust in our thinking about how to tackle some of the behaviours that I've talked about.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, we have we have similar issues in my borough to the one that you're giving the example about. And you know, I suppose the point that I'm trying to make is you need to look at each issue separately. There is not a magic bullet for any of these issues. It requires information sharing from lots of different people. And sometimes in that particular case, it is about enforcement and it is about taking a harder line. But in lots of other cases, you know, it's a lot more complex in terms of what that solution might be.
I'm looking at it through the prism of the victim, which is what this session is all about. And the other thing, Chair, that has not come up, certainly if it has, I'll fail to pick up on this. We still haven't talked practically about how do you actually put the victim at the heart of this whole process. Because right now, and I said this as a Commissioner, I don't belittle the work that a lot of good people are doing in the third sector, victim support and so on. But the experience of a lot of people who suffered from crime is getting a letter from victim support, sometimes a very badly photocopied letter, which I got when I was burgled some years ago. You've been the victim for crime. Well, I know it. You don't need to tell me that. We are here to A, B, C, D, E. And that's the end of the process. So what I'm looking at really, so far, which has not come up with your answers, is how do we actually put in practice the victim at the heart.
And I think
I've given my own thoughts to the Commissioner, by the way, and we're looking at ways of working with councils to put that into practice. But anyway,
yeah. No,
I think the other questions, then I've taken up some time.
I think that's a really good point made, and I think it's good that you met the Commissioner. I think the committee wants to also speak and address the Commissioner as well. That's the lead that's given by the Mayor to support victims, and I think we need to take an interest in that also. But that exchange shows the complexities around it. Ultimately, we need to be thinking about the victims in the boroughs and the effect of antisocial behaviour. But these cases can affect it. I mean, a very good case that was brought up in the earlier session was a noise nuisance by someone with mental difficulties, making a noise, playing very loud music, having a very detrimental effect on the neighbours that needed to be addressed, clearly, for the benefit of the neighbours, but that person had some serious issues and needed some support. And that one case study showed the complexities. So, Shirley, did you want to say something before we move on?
I did actually, because we have a lot of problem with properties, nuisance properties, and they can be brothels or crack houses or a mixture of both. But quite commonly, they are a vulnerable person who's been targeted by other people, and they've kind of moved into their property and taken over, and the whole of the block or the street or the community become a victim of that situation, because there's high footfall going in and out, there's bad behaviour, there's drinking, there's drug use, whatever. And I think there's a victim in the property and who's been targeted, and there's also a victim which are the community around it. And we have, sometimes it's a very slow process to change that situation. And I think now we're being more robust in our closure powers to close these properties. But when you go to court, if there's a vulnerable person in that property, and there will always be one, the judge does not like to close that property. So that's the issue that we have. And also, how do we help that particular victim? Because it will just set up in the next property and the next property. So I think a very, very effective way would be, when we do a property closure for 3 months, instead of having that vulnerable person on the street for 3 months or going into a B&B and then going back to their property or moving on and perpetuating the cycle, I think we should have safe spaces for victims where they get a 3-month intervention, so we can quickly access the victim, we can let them visualise what's going to happen. We're going to take you to a place of safety. This is what will happen. Your property will be closed. And during that time, we use our already commissioned services. We're not paying for anything extra, so we use the drug services in that area. We use the sexual health services, if they need sexual health engagement, nutrition, emotional well-being, mental health, and all of those professionals can visit that particular property in any borough where these people are being kept safe for a period of 3 to 6 months while we work on the issue around their property. Sends a very strong message to the public. They see this sort of behaviour in a property, bang, the person's gone, the property's Cytex, it's closed for 3 months. We don't tolerate this sort of antisocial behaviour. And that's the way that I would like to see it going. What is slowing that down from happening is the victim in the middle of the situation. Sometimes they're coerced, sometimes they're complicit, but they are still a victim because of their vulnerabilities. And they're often in need of a lot of medical attention, a lot of health, a lot of substance misuse, mental health, everything. And if we can stabilise them through that period, they reach a platform whereby they can view their life slightly differently. We then rehouse them through their same housing provider in a managed transfer, but with a package of care if they qualify for that, and move it forward that way. That would be my gold standard of victim care in terms of antisocial behaviour in London.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So we move now on to actually tackling and preventing. So we're moving from the victim to actually having less victims in the first place. And a subset of questions, Susan.
Yeah, hello. Good partnership working, in my view, makes such a difference. So if I ask you firstly, what do you think London is like? Do you think all the partners work well together?
Again, I do feel that it's very inconsistent. It does depend on what borough you're on, what existing services in place, the skill sets of those individuals. I think through people being more mindful of money over the recent years, we have seen a lot of diversifying of roles and people taking on additional roles that perhaps they're not always suited for. So I do think there needs to be potentially more localised reviews of, okay, so what have we changed, what additional roles we added to those teams, are they suitable for that role? But generally, as partnership work goes, I think there's been a huge improvements over the years. It's a lot more commonplace, it's a lot more fluid in the way that people work, it's standard. I remember sort of 10 years ago when some of the things we were doing was just unheard of because you just didn't work together. I mean, those days are long gone. But I think it's also about people identifying where their true values are. There is a little bit of crossover in terms of what their goals are, but actually just re-evaluating and looking at what isn't being done very well. We'll focus on that. You focus on that bit because you're better equipped to deal with that. And so we're also seeing a lot of, particularly our services, where instead of being standalone, we're actually doing integrated services where the council might deliver the bulk of one element of that service, being an ASB, response team or a pastoral or whatever, and then we'll deliver the key bits that either they don't do very well or it's not operationally viable for them to deliver, and then together that delivers a much better outcome. So we're seeing a lot more of this collaborative working. We're also similarly seeing that with RSLs, where they perhaps don't have a huge footprint on the borough, they don't have a lot of stock, but they still have issues, they still need a service. It's not viable for them to fund an independent community warden or caretaker or other form of capable guardian. So what we're doing is they just buy into an existing local service, or we bring them all to the table, they'll contribute an equal amount to that, and then you develop a service around focusing on their priority needs. We find that a very efficient way of tackling the issues they have.
Thank you. I mean, if I ask all of you, what do you think the strengths and the weaknesses are of partnership working?
For me, I mean, the strengths are around getting a fuller picture and sharing the information and dealing with it according to the many needs of many of these victims. There are pressures on all partners. It's not just about money, but there are some of the interventions do cost money. So if you want to redesign your adventure playground I was talking about, where there was complaints of drugs, there's a cost to the local authority for that. The impact and cost around mental health are huge. If you had a drug problem or a drink problem, diversion activities cost money. And I think housing, all those issues. So they're not directly police problems, but it plays an impact in the way that the police would try to assist to solve a problem.
Certainly, I would just add that we used to sit around the table in the partnership meetings, and people would bring a lot of tactical tools to how we could solve our antisocial behaviour issues. Mobile CCTV, youth workers who are working on the street. So you're predicting where your antisocial behaviour problems are going to be, and going, right, well, we need people in these areas, perhaps on a Friday and Saturday evening. We need resources when school finishes, maybe in the town centres or transport hubs, and having some of those youth workers and other partnership resources, not just officers, was really helpful. And we're seeing just a general reduction in that. So yes, the partnership process is still in place, but there's just sort of less resources and less sort of tactical options. So it's often then coming back to the safer neighbourhood teams, the PCSOs, who are sort of the ones out there. But we still very much rely so heavily, as there's mental health and various other support services, particularly adult and social care, that play such an instrumental role in problem solving the issues.
I would say, I think things in terms of the sort of range of partners that have been engaged, I think over time that has improved in some respects. Certainly, I remember about 10 years ago, housing organisations weren't always engaged in that kind of multi-agency work in the same way that they are now, and that's better. I think one of the things that came through a lot through police and crime plan consultation and just our general discussions with partners out in boroughs is that health partners and engaging them in this type of work is still difficult. There are some areas obviously where you've had more success, but that's not universal. And even where health partners are engaged, the thresholds for accessing their services and those kinds of things can often be barriers to getting people into those services. So I think that's still a difficult area.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with everything everything that's been said. A couple of points is that the partnership or the partners that you need to work with needs to be very wide. It's not just statutory partners. There's obviously a key role for the voluntary sector. We work very closely with the immigration services in Croydon around tackling antisocial behaviour. Crystal Palace Football Club, who are in the borough, are very active in terms of helping with things like youth activities in particular areas. So making use of those kind of facilities and those kind of opportunities is really key. But the other point that I'd want to make is that what's also essential in all of this is about actually having the right processes and not to rely too heavily on individual relationships, which can be the case. You need to make sure that you've got the right processes in place so that when people do move on or when things do change, actually you've still got some resilience to fall back on in terms of, well, this is the way that we do things here. So, yeah, that would be my issue.
Shirley, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the strengths are phenomenal in multi-agency working, because you get everybody in a room, everybody works together and comes to understand each other's role, their service, the capability, the resources, the challenges, and then really begin to understand holistically how something will work. And I think that is the main benefit, I think, of multi-agency working. And I would say the weakness would be everybody has a part to play, and whilst everybody might be willing to play their part, there are staff turnovers and changes and things like that. So I think when you're problem solving any issue, there has to be somebody who's orchestrating and leading and keeping an eye on everything else, and people don't particularly want to be that person, and I would say that's where the weakness is. So
that's interesting. Yes, thank you. Commander Bennett, you mentioned that sometimes you have problems with information sharing, and Andy, you mentioned it as well, and certainly when I've been involved, health has been the one that don't come to the table. Have you experienced any other agency that's an issue, or perhaps you don't find health an issue? What?
I mean, if there's a meeting to discuss an individual case, the information can obviously be shared, but there's no routine, automatic, single database or, where all the information is shared. That's the gap.
Okay. Anybody else? Any other gaps that you have
Well,
recognised?
I wouldn't want to pick out any particular organisation. I mean, I think it goes back to the issue that I mentioned about having the right processes and agreements in place, making sure that you've got information and sharing agreements and that they are agreed at the right level, because then you have something to fall back on in terms of actually making sure that you can move forward. It's also about being clear with people about the purpose of sharing information. There's information that's nice to have, but actually we want information that we can do something with. So you've got to be really clear about what the purpose of that information sharing, why do you need it and what you're going to do with it.
Thank you. So how would any of you or all of you think that the Mayor could assist with best practice being shared across London? Because there's certainly really good pockets and some areas where, and you've identified that, Lee, where it's not so good. So how do you think the Mayor could assist us with sharing all these very good ideas and different ideas that come from different boroughs?
Sadly, the obvious ones are the ones that come with money as well. I mean, when you're talking about sort of IT and but if you had that ability to say you were concerned, whatever agency you're from, you're concerned about a particular case, and you're able to enter it onto a system, and that comes up and is shared with all your partners, and people can then add their information. That's quick time information sharing. At the moment, yes, you may be, or let's say one agency, for them, they've only got a small bit of the jigsaw, they think it's low risk, and it's not a priority for them. They're not automatically going to be disclosing that information. To improve that, to have some infrastructure, yes, we have our partnership meetings, yes, we come together, but we prioritise the high-risk cases. Sometimes you don't know that something that's medium risk should be high because other people are holding those important bits of information. So I think speeding that process up would really assist.
If you're talking about that, sometimes within those meetings, we all know that it's highly confidential, so you can't put things like that down. But if you look more strategically at the way in which you do things could be shared as opposed to specific issues, because sometimes people have groups together that really work well, and they work well because of a reason, not because of particular cases. Because, as I say, we all know you can't share an awful lot that goes on in those particular meetings. So how do you think the Mayor could inform all the boroughs of the best practice around London?
Well, I think, again, even, your last panel in July, Paul Dunn talked about, he used to do the London ASB case managers forum, but even just sort of hosting a forum on ASB where all the relevant agencies can be invited and talk about best practice. It's just making people aware. It's that communication. There are people doing outstanding work in different pockets of London, and that needs to be advertised and promoted more effectively, and let professionals talk about it and ask the questions. Yeah. And when they're reassured, then that's a model they can adopt. And it's more helpful if you're doing it in a multi-agency environment like that.
Absolutely.
I'll just add a couple of things to that. I mean, I think that's an interesting thought about that, because obviously we previously had a forum. Of course, we didn't run it by ourselves. We did that in partnership actually with London councils, which I think is actually quite important in this space, because local authorities have a lot of skin in the game in respect of antisocial behaviour, and we certainly wouldn't want to unilaterally make a decision or do anything like that. We manage all of this work through our London Crime Reduction Board and our partnerships there. And so certainly this would be a conversation we'd want to have in that kind of wider partnership space. When we were going around to boroughs and talking about the police and crime plan, and antisocial behaviour came forth as a priority that everybody wanted to have included as one of their local ones. I have to say the issue of the kind of broader governance, good practice show, none of that came through in that conversation. So I was interested to see that it was coming out from your last meeting. The other thing that I would add to that is that I think also there is a sort of wider role potentially for the Home Office in some of this space, because there was a lot of discussion at your last meeting about the tools and powers, and whether legislation works well, are they the right tools, etc. And actually I think there's a bit of national work that we could easily have done in that space that the Home Office can do, because there will be good practice outside of London also.
Yeah.
And so I think there's another sort of layer to this that could be looked at.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure we can all learn all the time. That's right. Shirley, how do you think that the ASB Marex have helped with information sharing?
I think they've helped with information sharing because we do have set protocols and agreements, and they're all very clear and people sign up to them at the right level, and that's fed down to the people that attend the meetings. And I think we've positioned ourselves as being a rapid response to any sort of situation around a perpetrator, or in Brent we work mainly with the victims, who are often a perpetrator as well, as my colleagues have said. And I think the sharing of information there works well because over time, we meet monthly, but people have seen the outcomes from a community MARAC of working to that model, and that's given individual agencies confidence to share the information. You know, the purpose of sharing the information is to resolve the situation and make it better for the victim. And they can see that happening in a short period of time, unlike DV MARACs, where they don't come back every month. And I think that professionals really have bought into community MARAC models, and they know the value of bringing information along. And they do challenge each other quite a lot, the professionals within the meetings. And so I think it's moved safeguarding and information sharing forward quite a bit, really. And yeah, I think people can see the outcome of their work, so they're willing to share the information to get the job done, really. And nobody likes to carry risk alone, and that's what we try to tell people. The purpose of information sharing is you can't solve a problem as an individual agency most of the time, and share the problem. By sharing the problem, you're sharing the risk. The risk is documented and assessed in the meeting, and any decisions or actions taken from that meeting have been agreed by a group of professionals, not subjectively by one individual. And so I think that's where it's really made a difference, Susan.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Right, we're now moving to the newish legislation, which is the Antisocial Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act 2014, which the new powers replaced, in essence, the existing powers against ASB with a range of others, including the community trigger and the community remedy, which may or may not have caught the public imagination. So we've got some questions around that. I think, Caroline, you're leading.
I'm not going to focus on the community remedy and
On
trigger. That's my colleagues going to do that after. But just from you all, what impact have the new powers in the 2014 Act had on tackling antisocial behaviour in London?
I think it simplified and tidied it up and made it clearer. I mean, the police are probably more likely to use the criminal behaviour orders because we're more often involved in the criminal environment than the civil courts. But of course, there's a whole range of injunction capabilities as well. But that does come at a cost. So overall, I think that the orders and the new powers are clearer and do address the problems.
So have you been getting good results using them?
Yeah, I mean, the ones that are particularly popular with colleagues across all of London, as I say, the criminal behaviour orders, because that's easier for officers to obtain than going to a civil court. The dispersals and the closures, those have been sort of bread and butter powers, and they found those relatively easy. The dispersals, particularly with the inspector's authorisation, that's a quick time power that can be put into place, so that's been extremely useful. And again, we're seeing more use around the CPNs at the moment. So that's a good tactical tool. So overall, it's been well received. A lot of the powers are being used a lot, but not all. The PSPOs, again, there's a more consultative approach, and it's local authority led rather than police led. So that's again a useful tool, which I think people are still learning to use. So overall, I think officers have said it's been fantastic to simplify the legislation.
Is that feeling reflected by other partners here? Has there been a good impact from this legislation?
Yes, we've used them widely, and we've found that they've had a very good impact in the borough. We currently have 8 PSPO public space protection orders in place, 6 are drinking pilots, and they were commissioned in small pockets where our intelligence showed us that the problem was most prevalent. And we commissioned that for councillors so they could take a view to making a borough-wide PSPO on drinking in public. I would say that also there is some need there for some community awareness, because with emerging communities, their culture is often to stand on the street and drink, so they don't understand that they're intimidating anybody, because that's their culture. So the wider public need to know that that is a cultural thing for them, and then they need to know that it's not an acceptable thing in London. So we're doing some work around that. And we've got 2 PSPO in place for casual labour, where we have coaches coming into the borough to drop people to feed the cash in hand work market. So we've got PSPOs for those 2 as well. And we plan to use PSPOs in the parks to replace the park bylaws by next month. And they will also supersede the dog control orders by next month. We found that it works really well. We've closed a lot of shisha bars using the new tools and powers in the borough, using the closure powers more robustly with multi-agency evidence. And that's where we gather the multi-agency evidence from different teams within the organisation. And we build that information on ESONs, which is a multi-agency platform whereby we can share this information, and it cross-references everybody and everything, so that gives us a really good picture. And I think one of my favourites of the new tools and powers is I actually gave a 90-year-old lady with vulnerabilities a CPN. She had schizophrenia, and she had been causing a lot of problems for her neighbours, and she wouldn't engage with older people's mental health, GP or anything like that. We tried absolutely everything. And then we decided to give her a CPN because she'd worked well to a previous warning from police. But what we did is we got mental health in advance to document their approval of this course of action and saying it was in her best interest. Because a lot of people who cause antisocial behaviour also have personality disorders, and they're not well managed by mental health. They're seen as a lower order. But these are the people that are acting out on our streets and causing problems, vandalism, antisocial behaviour and things like that. And we're actually doing them a favour by giving them a CPN, because they need very clear boundaries and consequences. So by giving them a CPN, they know where the line is, and they tend, if they can, if it's within their capacity to do so, they will stop at that line. So we're using it in that respect around some problematic people in the borough. And also the tools and powers we use to quickly quench a situation with young drug dealers who are congregating outside a tube station. And yes, the drug dealing is criminal, but it's getting the evidence in time to satisfy the public who are afraid to come through the station on their way from work. And also we use the housing providers to work with the parents to try and control the situation. But again, that was slow. They need evidence in order to do that. So again, we use CPNs on the antisocial behaviour. So the noise they were making, the litter they were dropping, blocking the pathway, that sort of thing. And so we managed to kind of reduce the problem. We haven't solved the problem, but we've reduced the problem down to 1 or 2 people who keep going back to the area. But where there were 15, there's only 1 or 2. So we find the combination of criminal and ASB, tools and powers, works really well together. You know, if you've got a good group of people problem solving and looking at the issues. So yeah, it's working
Really
for us.
help you, and it's a really good picture there of how you're using the different aspects. Andy, do you want to comment from Croydon?
Yeah, so I'd agree that it has helped in terms of simplifying what was quite a complex area. We are using them, using the various powers in sort of variable quantities. We're only just going out for the first PSPO. We're out for consultation at the moment in Croydon, so we have no direct experience of using that power at the moment. I would echo everything that Shirley has said about CPNs. I mean, that in particular probably is the standout success story for us in terms of the new tools. They are incredibly helpful and flexible. We're using them in a very wide variety of circumstances. Things like the examples that Shirley has given, but we're also looking at them for things like environmental problems as well, you know, untidy front gardens and alleyways, sometimes in abandoned vehicles or unsightly vehicles, you know, noise issues, a whole range of different things, and they are a really useful first step in terms of a formal process to try and get a solution. And we find very few of the initial warnings actually then go on to any kind of other formal action, so they're quite a quick you know, remedy. The other issue that I would raise that hasn't been picked up is around the positive requirements element for CBOs and injunctions, which when it came out we thought was fantastic, but there have been some issues that we've experienced in terms of actually trying to carry those through. So we have applied positive requirements about whether that's you know, attending a treatment service or whatever it might be, but actually the enforcement of that and enforcement of breaches has been problematic in terms of the information sharing from the drug service or whoever it may be. So fantastic idea, and if it works in practice it would be great, but the actual implementation has been a challenge for us.
Yeah, no, I can see that. Lee, do you want to add any other examples of what's working well with the legislation?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of CPNs, especially with the warning side of things, we find that they're very effective because it's giving you an opportunity to actually go and engage with an individual, address their behaviour. The delivery of that is key, but what we are seeing in some areas, we're seeing in one borough that we work, I think it's 92% of people haven't reoffended, and it's because of that contact. And instead of it just being sort of this, please don't do this, there is a consequence to it now, and that's what this legislation has enabled. There's also an element to it as well that because it can be reported by anyone, it almost creates an environment of social surveillance, and that in turn regulates behaviour. So we are finding that a very effective tool, particularly on the warnings, and not even having to progress to the notice. For longer term or sustained reductions, we're seeing that injunctions are very effective, but in a lot of cases it's the data that you have, and it depends on who's out getting the data and to what standard that data is being collected to. But we're finding that they're a very effective tool as well. So where it stands at the moment, a lot of our patrolling elements will do a lot of the evidence package, spending the time in the area, looking at what the impact of the address is having, documenting that, building up that nice case file, and then putting it over to the Safer Communities team, who've then got everything they need to then effectively and promptly deal with the address or take out the injunctions. We're also seeing a lot of cases where we've got offenders who there isn't enough evidence for the criminal action, particularly maybe more organised drug dealers where they're not handling the drugs, they're not in possession, everything's association. It's, you know, we'll be tasked to an area where there's something not quite right. They've identified that young people aren't playing out in the park anymore, even though the weather's good. There's acquisitive crime types are starting to increase. There's, you know, paraphernalia being found, so there's clearly something going on. You then identify address, you identify an individual, you start identifying the vehicles, but at no time is there enough of an incident to call the police in to warrant things like searches and stuff like that. So then it's just that constant evidence in that impact that it's having on the wider community, getting to a stage where everything's identified, then putting it back to the police so they can do something that's a lot more intelligence-led and a lot more efficient use of their resources as well, because you're using a sort of a non-emergency response service to identify and spend the time there for them to do the targeted work, put the two together, and then obviously look at things like injunctions where there hasn't been an arrest made. So we're finding them quite effective, particularly in West London.
Very good, thank you for that. And what training is available? Because this also, it's newish legislation, it's very different. Has there been sort of comprehensive training across London through London councils or the Met? Or?
I think I sort of said it briefly earlier, but all officers, patrolling officers will do the computer package. All neighbourhood officers, in addition, are getting a bespoke modular training on antisocial behaviour in probably the next 6 months will be completed.
So they'll be fully up to speed. What about officers and others in housing associations, the boroughs?
In Brent, they've done it within the organisation, within the department. So I would say that is a gap, and we don't see any providers of that on the horizon. So I would say that there's a gap there around the use of the tools and powers.
So that
we learn most about it from the ASB forum that was mentioned that Paul Dunn runs. That's where we learn from our colleagues through trial and error, you know, what's working, you know, where the problems have been and how it's best applied.
So that could be through MOPAC, some sort of London-wide bit of training, but then also hearing from boroughs where you're being innovative. I mean, your thing about casual labour, I think it's very interesting, because I'm sure lots of boroughs will have places and wouldn't have even considered that. So, okay, did you want to add something, Andy?
Yeah, well, no, exactly the same picture in Croydon. You know, previously we've engaged in the ASB sort of forum, which has been useful. We have bought our own training in for officers, so when the Act came in, we did some multi-agency training for, you know, local police colleagues and a whole range of other partners in terms of what it did, but basically it's managed in-house at the moment, so some kind of regional resource would be very helpful.
Okay. And in terms of measuring how effective these new tools are, I mean, it sounds fantastic, the examples you've given. I'm sure there are plenty more across the capital, but how is that being measured? Is that something MOPAC's doing a piece of work on?
We're not specifically doing any work on that at the moment. What we will be doing, as the antisocial behaviour is one of our local priorities, obviously, we'll be monitoring that as we go through on a quarterly basis annually, and what we're looking for, obviously, in local areas is year-on-year reductions. But we're not doing anything specifically in terms of those powers. And I think there is, I suppose, the other way in which you might measure that is looking at kind of repeat victimisation and whether or not people are coming back through the system, because actually if they are, that means whatever you've put in place is not actually an effective response. And so we do look at repeat victimisation also.
But if you can assess the numbers, and that might be what you're doing for your targets that you're measuring, but actually unless you're putting in place potentially training, if you're not putting in place showing that best practice and then actually seeing how effective, you know, a year on, 2 years on, different boroughs have done these different things, you know, how will you know if this is being effective, and also what is triggering, what happens to your target around antisocial behaviour?
I think that's probably a fair question. I think for us, though, from our point of view, what we're trying to do is create the right conditions for local areas to be able to do some of that themselves. So it is a mandatory priority. That means that resources follow that. That means the MPS align their resources to delivering that, and the dedicated ward officers are obviously the resource that they put in place for that, and that we make money available through the Crime Prevention Fund for people to be able to do those things at the local level, whether that is about training their staff or, you know, how they use the powers. And we see ourselves operating in that space as opposed to necessarily directly providing training and making that happen.
What about the Met? What are you doing to see how effective these new tools and powers are?
Well, we have a meeting which is quarterly at the moment. We have the 32 boroughs of London from the Met side. Their sort of chief inspector leads attend. Mr. Bennett chairs the meeting. We review a whole variety of performance data from the amount of calls they've got, from the satisfaction levels. We go and micromanage quite a lot, so we can look at exactly how many cases they've got and what they're doing with it. Beyond that, we then do the sharing of best practice. So I'm aware that some of you will be going after this to Tower Hamlets, be looking at a project they've done there using some ASB warnings. Hackney as well have done a project around their repeat victims and callers, and that's been very effective. We've had other people, dealing with specific ASB issues, and they've had success, and they come and present. So we do review. We look at all 32 boroughs. We look at we have analysts that provide us the data. So we go into that, and we talk about the use of the powers as well.
Okay, it just feels to me that maybe in our outcomes from our work, but actually there's a gap there. If this is a target for every borough in London, what really is MOPAC doing to drive this down and share best practice? And I'm not clear.
Okay, right. Well, Miss, you want to come in then,
Sorry,
Tony?
can I just very quickly come in on that? Because I think Assemblyman Pigeon has raised a very important issue about training and the consistency across the whole of London. Very quickly, Chair, I attended an all-day training session that Newham Police organised with Newham Council's Enforcement Service, where every designated ward officer, all of Newham's enforcement officers, the people who got to work together in partnership were there. And it was a very practical exercise of basically intelligence sharing, but also how to use powers. But much more importantly, something that I was worried about, and I asked the Deputy Mayor about this, that the obligation now on each sort of borough police force, that ASP is now a priority for each borough. Basically, who does what, and avoid the duplication of resources of work, and who takes ownership of the drive. And so can I ask you, Commander Bennett, would you consider looking at the new model and see if each of London's 32 boroughs can do something similar?
ASB is a priority for the Met.
I know
It's
Croydon have done
it's a
something like
priority
that.
for every borough. About 3 months ago, I did an hour's session on
Yeah.
performance and some of the high-level strategic issues on antisocial
Yeah.
behaviour with each borough commander, 32 of them. So they know and they're responsible for reducing it and dealing with it on their borough.
Okay, Tony.
I'd like to ask, please, how the new rules have assisted you in dealing with the antisocial problems created by travellers, and if you could give me some examples of how it's assisted.
Now, I mean, obviously we have existing legislation already, but I'm not aware of any specific examples of how it's been used to deal with the travellers.
Do any of you know how this has helped you in dealing with the problems created by travellers? Because pretty well every example of antisocial behaviour which we have in our list of what is antisocial behaviour is created simply by the existence of a single traveller's site. That's a multi-agency thing, and these regulations ought to have helped you in dealing with some of those. Are you able to give me any examples? Any of you?
Well, I mean, a traveller's site itself is not antisocial. It's the,
No.
I'm talking the behaviour, the associated behaviour.
Precisely. I'm talking about the antisocial behaviour created by traveller sites.
I can't give you specific examples. I don't know if there are. But
I can't give you an example, but I know that Oxford City Council have used the tools and powers on a traveller site. And again, we heard about this at one of the ASB forums, where they gave a presentation about how they'd used the tools and powers to address antisocial behaviour by travellers. And I can't remember it all, but they did say that they had come up with a strategy whereby the children are used to target the police and any other agencies when you go on site. And they were CPNing the matriarch and patriarch of the site for the behaviour of the children. So if any of the children interfered with their engagement, then they would, be in breach of a CPN. But that's all I can remember. I could see lots of things going wrong with that.
Okay, Commander, if I can... you said that you've discussed this with each borough commander to deal with this. Kingston has recently had a problem. All of the boroughs on my patch, I represent Hounslow, Kingston and Richmond, we've had traveller problems.
Can I just clarify? I had a long session on antisocial behaviour. I didn't discuss travellers during that session.
Are you suggesting that perhaps the problems created by travellers are in a completely different category and are not antisocial behaviour?
No.
So you would agree, all of you, that littering, noise disturbance, various other environmental matters, trespass and things like that, would you all agree that those are matters which legitimately fall in the antisocial behaviour purview?
They could do. I mean, it depends on the threshold. I mean, London as a densely populated capital city, of course, it's different to a more rural part of England.
No, I'm relating this to London. During the summer, I have had problems with traveller sites. In all of the boroughs I represent, my guess is that all of my colleagues who are constituency members will have had difficulties with travellers. We know how expensive it is. In Kingston, for example, it's cost them £20,000 a day for to clear up and to manage a site where there were just 11 traveller caravans, 11 and other associated vehicles a day. This is an extremely expensive thing. It's extremely high profile. Many of the things that we've been talking about, are personal matters of antisocial behaviour and so on. But this is something which impinges on large numbers of members of the public. And there is a belief, hopefully it's anecdotal, but I don't believe that it is anecdotal, that the police and other agencies really are frightened of travellers. And I'm very interested in the point you made about what was happening in Oxford. Certainly I've experienced this business as children who suggested to local authority workers who came onto the site, a particular site, to deal with problems created by travellers, and the children, clearly very well briefed, suggested that the people who were taking photographs of the litter and the rest of it on the site were paedophiles because this was the way that they had been briefed by the streetwise travellers. The upshot of it is that I can think, certainly of the events which have happened this year, there have been no charges relating to antisocial behaviour caused by travellers' sites across my patch. And I would like to ask whether or not you think, therefore, that the existing legislation isn't strong enough, or that the new legislation failed to take these matters into account.
I think we've certainly, we don't have the specifics to give you today around any sort of case examples, but certainly the police are not frightened of dealing with these issues. They tend to use the legislation that they've got and move people on. What we will do is take this away, come back and give you perhaps some more.
I think that's give me any kind of statistic at all as to whether or not there have been any prosecutions of travellers for offences caused by travellers right across the MPS area.
You can write to us if you don't have that information, because clearly this wasn't part of the particular briefing. But
no, but this is major antisocial. We all know it. We've all experienced it.
I'm going to add to it.
Does MOPAP have any figure on this?
No, we don't. I mean, the data that we have.
Would you accept it's a problem? Unlawful traveller sites?
It can be a problem, and clearly
No, not that it can be a
associated with
problem, that it is a problem in London. You know, that's kind of avoiding the issue, saying it can be a problem.
Well,
Those of us who represent
Yes.
know that it is a real problem. I'm sure that Shirley would accept that even in Brent, travellers create difficulties.
In Brent, we have a traveller site. That doesn't particularly cause us any issues.
I specifically said unlawful.
Oh, yeah. Well, unlawful ones, we seem to get rid of them very quickly. I can't tell you how, because I haven't been involved. But
and the points are very well made. I think, importantly, yes, unlawful sites are a serious issue. I'm constituting Croydon, Sutton. I spent a whole year removing travellers from the field. One of the weaknesses of the legislation is not the legislation in front of us, but the legislation required to remove the sites, which is another debate altogether. I think this committee should add to its work programme this particular issue so that we can have witnesses come along, including representatives potentially of travellers' community. But it is clearly an issue in the constituencies, and often there is antisocial behaviour, often, not always. These new powers are there to address those examples of antisocial behaviour. So I think it's been raised, and I think this committee continue to do some work around that. Sorry, did you want to come in?
In doing that, there are some peripheral issues that really haven't come up in the debate, and sorry I had to leave for part of it, it may have come up. But the same issues applying to travellers, albeit you know, the law and about moving on, when does it become antisocial behaviour, when it's a criminal act and enforcement of trespass and the issues. But the same around licensing laws. It's very interesting around antisocial behaviour arising out of a licensing establishment and the lack of how often that doesn't come up at some of your partnership meetings, even though you local authorities have got responsible for licensing, you police officers have got responsible for enforcing the law. So, and somehow in terms of that antisocial behaviour bit that rises from that, which is some persistent antisocial behaviour and have an impact on neighbourhoods, individuals collectively, if not, I'd like us to do some more follow-up work around that.
I mean, that we have examples that I won't cite now. We've heard about good partnership working, but often you can have a breakdown in partnership working, sometimes between police, local authorities, around that particular issue. And we can pursue that separately.
It's a similar nature to that, I think, the travellers' issues. There is an antisocial behaviour element, but there's also other laws that deal with it, and sometimes it gets compartmentalised. That's not the right word, I'll trip over my tongue. If you understand what I mean in terms of the silos that we sometimes work in local authorities.
And we can pursue the point made that sometimes there is an impression that potentially travel communities may or may not be treated differently, and that we can pursue in a separate meeting. Unmesh, you
I just think it's a good point, because in the context of street drinking,
Yes.
Newham's done some, and I can only speak from my own experience, but Newham's done some work around withdrawing licenses
Yes,
of
absolutely.
supermarkets off licenses
Yes.
who sell single cans to street drinkers. So there's some imaginative work in partnership with the police. So there's some good examples. I would just say to the police, by the way, that so in terms of your answer to Assembly Member Arber's questions and points, perhaps you might want to look at Newham and Barking, where the police and the council have done some imaginative work in terms of unlawful sites, because it is an issue, yeah.
Good. Okay, yes, but we'll just carry on now. I think we've sucked that lemon dry, as Boris would used to say. Onka, you've got some questions now about community powers.
The 2014 Antisocial Behaviour and Crime Policing Act was designed to put the victims first. This is a question particularly for you, as starters to Shirley. Do you think that the community triggers, right, and the community remedy orders have been successful in doing that?
We've not actually developed the community remedy in Brent. That's something that the manager is looking to work on, but we haven't actually gone down that route at all in Brent with community remedies.
How about community triggers?
Community triggers, we have had a number of community triggers, not many. I think we've had about 7, but I do find that they're not discussed widely. I don't have any information on them.
Have local authorities brought this to the attention of their residents?
I don't believe so.
I mean, we heard at the committee in July that it wasn't in the interest of the local authorities to bring this to the interests of the local of the residents, right? I mean, why would you could just stick for your own backs?
We publicise it on our website, on Brent Council website, so it's there, all the information is there. And we find that the community triggers that we have, they come through the councillors of the borough when they're working with residents. Members tend to put them on the path to community triggers, and then we address the concerns of the residents, and they're mainly the triggers that we've had.
Okay. Andy, have you had an experience from Croydon?
Exactly the same experience as Shirley, although we've actually had less, I think, that have formally come through the community trigger route. I think we've had 2, and neither have been accepted as, in terms of the definition of what would trigger a community trigger. I think there is an issue of public awareness and following that route. We likewise have, we have information available on our website. So if you go to report antisocial behaviour, you can find information in terms of how to do it. But we haven't, certainly not recently, have done anything proactive in terms of encouraging that route. But we do get lots of inquiries via MPs and local ward councillors and what have you, where people, are not happy with the level of response that they've received. And sometimes that's because we haven't done things well, and we need to look at that. But sometimes it's about managing expectations and being clear about. It goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of this, which is about managing risk and actually getting to the bottom of what's actually happening. So some of the issues that get raised to us, people have very high levels of expectations. They think we can respond immediately. They think we can throw resources at it, but actually there's fairly low, maybe fairly low impact in terms of the officer's assessment. But in terms of the community trigger, that hasn't really landed, I don't think, for us locally, and we're not doing the community remedy either. I don't feel like that's.
Is there an underwide consensus of when a community trigger can be triggered? Is there a criteria which is agreed across London?
My understanding is there was a London-wide definition that was.
There are specific criteria, but I would agree with what's already been said. I think there's a lack of public awareness around it in general.
Do you think that actually this is an area which the MOPAC should be doing, particularly the Commissioner for Victim Sports, should be raising the profile of these orders, right? Is this useful work you think that the Mayor's Office can be doing? Letting the residents of London know these orders do exist, how they can trigger them?
Certainly, when the powers were enacted and implemented, we did some of that work, and we did work with partners to develop that London threshold so that we have a kind of common trigger level. And at the time, we did some publicity work, and those messages were pushed out. We haven't done any in recent years, I would agree, and certainly we rely on local areas to be publicising it locally, which mostly they are, and I think probably most of them are doing it through their websites.
I mean, looking at the evidence we've heard from this committee, it seems like this has been a well-kept secret. And I think it would be very useful if the Mayor's office did go out the way, right, as part of the victim support initiative which the Mayor is taking, is to make sure that the people of London are aware of these orders, they know how to trigger them, and hold people accountable, which was the spirit of the legislation. So I hope that that work can be done. But I also want to why is it that community remedies are so little used in London? I mean, we've heard so far it's not really being used at all, right? Why do you think that's the case?
I think there's elements of the community remedy that are being used, but it's not the community remedy sort of being acknowledged as something on its own. So when you look at what was on the menu that sort of MOPAC gave us to start with, you've got various things which would sort of fit more under restorative justice, and those elements do take place. We have people trained and they do that. Where again the similar stuff points that were around the positive requirements on legislation, and some of those are down there on the community remedy to address people's behaviour, courses to deal with drugs or alcohol or whatever it is. Those we haven't been able to get to. So I think as a whole the community remedy on its own is not known or sort of widely acknowledged. Elements within it are definitely done. So
I thought the community remedy was engaging with the local community to see what remedy they wanted to see. Are there examples of any London boroughs having a meeting with the community group and saying, well, this is antisocial behaviour is taking place here, what do you see as a remedy? Has any of that exercise been done at all, anywhere in London?
I'm not aware of any specifically, but I think there are two elements to that. So partly this is about the individual, so if you're committing the ASB against me about what do I want, so that might be an apology or whatever it is, and you could use it, I guess, in that broader sense. I think some boroughs, places like Westminster, have used some of those measures, for communities and wider impact, but I don't know how widespread that is.
It says here that the community remedy gives the victims a say in out-of-court punishment and perpetrators for low-level crime and antisocial behaviour. It's a list of actions that victims can choose from when a community resolution is being used, right? What I'm seeing, right, is that there is no evidence of this being used at all anywhere in London.
Sorry, there is, because we're telling you that it is. The elements that colleagues have just outlined. So people, sometimes an apology is all that's needed. Sometimes an understanding and seeing something from somebody else's point of view. But of course that doesn't always work in much more hardened cases. But sometimes there'll be reparation to the victim. The cost for a minor damage, that would be part of a community remedy, just as mediation would. So there are many components. I think the difficulties come when it might need to refer an individual for additional treatment, and there's often a funding implication of that.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
It's very clear that the trigger and the remedy have not been used to any great degree across London, and I think in our conclusions and recommendations in our report we need to sort of shout out loud around that.
Yeah.
And because they are available to residents. I think if we ask, for example, Safe and Able boards, even those clued up people may not even be completely aware of them. Clearly, in my mind, a community trigger being triggered is a sign potential failure of the authorities because the community have just fed up that they perhaps are not being listened to. It could even be used as a tactic by councillors. Councillors will go along, and I remember a conversation myself a while back that, do you really want this to be your first community trigger in a particular borough? Get your finger out and do some work around this. So I think that it is important that they are used, but people just don't know about them. And I think you made that point very, very strongly. Now, no discussion around policing will be complete without funding and resources. So, Sian, do you want to take these questions?
Yeah, I have some questions about resources. If I can start with Met resources first. Some of the evidence we've had from councils has highlighted the ways that they think potentially Met cutbacks have, or changes in where they're putting resources, have affected them. We've had a council telling us that they've lost the police officers on their antisocial behaviour units. We've had more generally feedback that the cutbacks in neighbourhood police officers compared with several years ago has had an impact. And it seems to me that prior to the consultation that went on, when we went out and asked what your priorities would be, antisocial behaviour wasn't a particular priority for the Met. So the Met officers able to sort of comment on that, potentially, that resources were taken away from antisocial behaviour because it wasn't a priority, and has that had an impact?
MOPEC and the Met are actually making a huge investment in neighbourhood policing, and that's why we've got the 2 dedicated
I'm thinking about the
officers.
past, though. I'm actually thinking about up to when you were told that this was a priority for safer neighbourhoods.
Yeah.
Up to that point, was it under-resourced? That's my question.
Well, there were officers obviously working in neighbourhood policing, but they weren't dedicated. And one of the issues was that they'd get abstracted to go to police a football match or a march in another part of London. The DWOs are ring-fenced and they're monitored, and I'm joint monitoring with MOPEC, so we can look at what the abstractions are. I haven't set an 80 or 90% target because I want 100% if I can get it. But of course there will be legitimate abstractions like training and holidays, etc. So there's a huge investment in neighbourhood policing, and antisocial behaviour is a key element. I mean, we consult all 629 wards to establish their priorities, and it's about 97–98% where ASB is a priority on those wards. So I would say it's a real priority for us.
And that's in contrast to previously?
Yes, I do. I think it's developed probably since 2010. The creation of airspace and a system to assist us to manage it has been a great improvement. So I think the situation this decade is different than it was previously.
I would just add that we have, in addition to or as part of the neighbourhood resource, every basic command unit is going to have a partnership and prevention hub. That is 19 officers whose sole job is to be looking and joining together antisocial behaviour with licensing and other issues where specialist officers with specialist skills, looking at how we reduce demand on the organisation, how we deal with the most risky areas. So that's an essential part in binding it all together. They'll be able to look at the most difficult, protracted cases and again make sure that linking in with all our partners that we do, if it's licensing and ASB, another bit to the agency, they could go in and provide support to the individual safer neighbourhood teams and get all those agencies to help problem solve issues.
Yeah, that problem-solving type approach seems a big improvement. I think you said before, mainly it has been just ordinary response officers who are sent out to cases that sort of pass the test when people call about ASB, who might not have local knowledge or links to the council or any of those things. So you can see why people might have thought it was neglected if somebody who's used to dealing with sort of bigger crimes turns up and dismisses their concerns. And hopefully the new partnership teams will take ASB more seriously.
In the process of change, people don't like change. So, you know, when you go back to the old 1-2-3 model, you know, that was popular and people liked that. We then moved to the local policing model in 2013, when that reduced in size, but then we had flexible officers working across a neighbourhood area. And again, even though that was an increase in total resource, people were sort of unhappy at the time because they considered their own individual team as shrinking. Now we move forward, we're going to a different system with properly ring-fenced officers with, say, a partnership and prevention hub providing a specialist oversight. So I would be optimistic going forward that we're going to have a resource there specifically dealing with antisocial behaviour.
If I can ask Natasha a question. Earlier on, you talked about funding things potentially through the London Crime Prevention Fund. One of the councils has fed back to us that they are concerned about MOPAC's decision to top slice 30% of the London Crime Prevention Fund, and that's reduced their resources that they're able to put into this. Can you explain what was happened there and what that is?
So the top slicing has been about creating a co-commissioning fund, because actually what boroughs fed back to us in respect of their crime prevention work was that actually sometimes they wanted to be able to work across boundaries. There were issues that were bigger than their borough, and they wanted to be able to have the conditions in which they could do that joint working. So that 30% has been put into a pot that is available to boroughs, and we're in the process of people bidding into that now, so that they can do cross-borough work and joint partnership work on whatever issues they think that they need to do that work on. So it's still available to boroughs, it's available to them in a different way. But from that London Crime Prevention funding, as I said, certainly over the next 2 years, boroughs have allocated 4.4 million to working on antisocial behaviour, and they're using that for things like supporting their community MARAC that deals with those ASB cases.
So the top slice, but the London Crime Prevention Fund hasn't grown overall. The top slice kind of does have to come off some existing projects, and that might be the borough's decision to reduce
yes,
it.
I mean, for them, what we asked them to do, they were able to tell us what projects they wanted to do and to manage that money at the local areas for them to determine what things they want to spend that money on.
Has MOPAC put any new resources specifically into sort of boroughs or working with boroughs as a result of the new priority to focus on antisocial behaviour?
Not other than the London Crime Prevention Fund in terms of funding, no. But one of the things, as I said, I think before, was that in terms of creating it as a local priority, what it does do is make sure that the MPS and others see to align their resources to those priority areas. So it helps to shift resources around. There is still always a finite pot.
So it's principally around alignment rather than new resources?
Yes.
Okay. Can I ask the borough representatives now? I think earlier on, I can't remember which officer mentioned working with youth workers and how that was a good thing. I know that councils have faced austerity, restrictions in the ability to raise council tax and things as well. Have you seen over previous years a reduction in your ability to focus on this issue, and has it been a priority for you as well?
I think the issues that we've experienced, I think we've probably become more reactive in the way that we deal with things. Things like universal youth provision has reduced, so there is less, youth centres in the sense that we had a few years ago. It's far more targeted now, and we still do have a very active and sort of targeted youth outreach function locally. We have to work very closely with the voluntary sector, but that in itself provides challenges in terms of coordination, because there are all sorts of fantastic projects and opportunities out there. It's about actually making sure that people know where they are and people are working together. So coordination is an issue. So coordination and prevention. I think on the preventative work, I think one of the gaps that we have seen, and this relates to antisocial behaviour, but also work that we're doing around things like serious youth violence and things like that, there is a bit of a gap in terms of sort of early intervention. So it's not just about the universal prevention, it's actually about intervening and supporting young people or their parents at an early stage. If people are in the criminal justice system, or they meet social care thresholds or what have you, then we generally have a grip on them, and there are support and services available. It's people who are falling below those thresholds, who we know in a year or 2 years are likely to be causing issues. We don't necessarily have the resources or the processes in place at the moment to grip on that. So we're not probably preventing things as well as we could do. The other pressure for us in the local authority is around funding for sort of physical measures. So an obvious example of that would be something like CCTV, which we get dozens of requests. We've got antisocial behaviour on our street. Can we have a CCTV camera? Managing that kind of that capital resource becomes an ongoing challenge. As well as actually a lot of the problems that we see, some of the environmental ASB can be solved by things like CCTV or lighting or fencing, gating, a whole range of removing benches, whatever it is. So that kind of coordination and money to actually design out crime is an increasing pressure for us as well.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly I see a lot of, I'm a local councillor as well, I see a lot of requests for those kind of physical measures, and there's a queue, it's a really long queue. Can I ask about Brent's approach to this and what you've done?
ASB and Brent used to have a 30k budget for diversionary activity for youth through the ASB team. That has been reduced to nil, and that 30,000 is probably going to be spent mainly on new signage around PSPOs, dog signs, controlled drinking areas, etc. So we have to replace all the signage that we had before. But we do have 20 deployable CCTV cameras, which we allocate in accordance to need through our local joint action groups. And we're being more proactive around the ASB offenders in that we're developing a risk matrix for ASB and gang nominals. So we're proactively preparing evidence in advance to enable CBOs to be issued at court when they are finally convicted. So all of that evidence has been built concurrently, really. And we're fortunate in that the Brent Council have funded 6 Met police officers, and the Met have match funded those. So we've now got a team of 12 officers in the borough, which we target for our priorities around ASB, which is very useful. And we've got 2 police officers in the team who work solely on closures and nuisance properties. So that's the way we're going at Brent.
Okay, that's really interesting to hear. Can I just, before we move on, ask Lee if the work that you do is a way of maybe using local authority resources a bit more efficiently?
Yeah, I mean, it's been our experience that actually we've seen a much clearer drive on putting more into responsive service, especially the early intervention, early prevention on the ground side of things. We've seen a steady increase over the last couple of years, consistently in putting more services out on the ground. What I think this whole process has achieved is that it's made people be a lot more efficient in what they do, a lot more sensible in the way they spend, doing more with what they have got, and then at the point of saturation where they can't do any more within what they're already doing, then looking at being more realistic in what we do and don't need. And it's made people be quite creative in freeing up different types of funds and using different types of pots of money, more focused towards ASB. For example, things like gate locking services, they're usually tied in within grounds maintenance contracts. They're usually overpriced because it's an unknown when they first contract for it. But a lot of places don't actually need to be locked. Where a lot of boroughs don't have the evidence base to actually prove that, other boroughs do. In those boroughs that can say, do work in Antisocial and can say there's not really issues here, you can then knock some of those locks off. That then drops the price of that overall locking contract by half. That can be then reinvested into something that's more tangible, more focused around ASB or supporting victims or whatever. So we've seen a lot of that type of behaviour. But again, it's having that intelligence base to show which ones where you can make those savings. And it's about having flexibility. So if the problem does re-emerge there, then being able to add that to the lock, take another one off that you've now evidence doesn't need, and so on. It's just, there's a lot more of this intense management of the specifics of delivery, which is then freeing up money and resources to do more.
Thank you for that. Right. The last set of questions is around about what more can be done to tackle antisocial behaviour, particularly around the mayor and Mopac Lynn.
Okay, and some of it we would have covered,
Yes,
would have come up in bits and pieces, but we just want to, for the sake of our records, and so we will go back over and reflect on what you've said to us. We'll do it for neatness. So I think, if I can start with you, Natasha, Mopac, what does the Mayor's commitment in the police and crime plan deliver? A police service that is better equipped to deal with crime and antisocial behaviour locally involve? What do we think that is?
That's particularly, I think Julian's mentioned this, is focused around those additional resources in the neighbourhoods, and those dedicated ward officers who are working on the ground in those local communities and will know where these problems persist, and that they will be working in partnership obviously with others in those localities to address these issues, because that partnership piece is really important. I think the police and crime plan obviously is talking about delivering a better police service, but actually it has a strong partnership focus too, and that partners, certainly through the London Crime Reduction Board, are also signed up to this as a local priority, and that they will also put their resources and they're working behind that particular priority. So in terms of local focus, it means that actually we're all agreed that this is an issue that we should all be tackling, that we realign resources accordingly so that actually there's resource to deal with them. And obviously our London Crime Prevention funding comes in behind that to provide some kind of practical financial support to that process also.
So can I just follow up on that? Can I quickly turn to Julian then? So are we clear then that the locally based ward officers and their mission is clear within the police service of what they do or don't do amongst the many things that we're asking these locally based resource to work on? And let me give you an example. So, are they just engaging with the public, which I've had some police officers tell me that's all they do in terms of that, or are they an asset deployed in tackling crime, which I think you're going to say yes to, but I have to ask this question because I'm not sure if the Met's consistent across London. So tell me, what is it? Do you know what I mean?
I would very much hope that it is consistent because I mean, at the beginning of the training that I've talked about, there's a video from Assistant Commissioner Martin Hewitt and Sophie Linden, the Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, just saying just how important this issue is and describing their role. There are a whole range of activities that we expect ward officers to do, and they will need to prioritise them. But making the lives of that community better, of which antisocial behaviour and bad behaviour is a key element, is absolutely what they're there for. And problem solving in a partnership way is absolutely their core function.
Do you think the Met sufficiently attitudinal and culturally understands where antisocial behaviour can lead? If I give you the over the years development of the Met's attitude towards domestic violence, of this is just a dispute between two parties and we shouldn't get involved back in maybe the 60s, 50s and developing on, where we know domestic violence leads to murder, is the Met officers and the training sufficiently clued up that the victim here is facing probably a great mental health, distress, and in some cases antisocial behaviour can lead to violence and murder?
I'm not sure, yes.
Can I just add to that, just to comment on the journey the Met has gone on in terms of ASB, which specifically answers that. When we go back to sort of 2010 or before, you know, we were managing some high-risk cases of antisocial behaviour on our crime system. We didn't have capacity to manage any more. So there was always, back there was the potential for cases to slip through the cracks because we wouldn't have known all the background. We then moved forward and we did manage some on spreadsheets. It wasn't very joined up. We couldn't share the information. And it was the local policing model in 2013 when we launched our airspace system. For the first time, every single ASB incident should be reported onto airspace the way crime is onto our crime system. That builds a rich picture. The first job that officers have to do is search for any previous linked incidents, so you combine it all together. That brought us forward light years in terms of where we are. Combine it with the partnership processes which are in place in every single borough of London, and we've got a much better grip and a much better understanding of where the antisocial behaviour is taking place, but particularly around vulnerable victims. I think you bring it forward to now and the training that's taking place. Yes, we're not perfect, but over that period from 2010 2011, we've seen the amount of calls for antisocial behaviour half, the amount of repeat victims half as well. So talk to the public, they may give a different picture whether it's a success. Maybe some other agencies have had an increase in demand going their direction. But I think genuinely we can say there's been significant improvements and gains in the last 7 years. There's plenty more to do, as we've heard today.
Yeah, last year, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary rated the Met good for ASB, and I think we're better now. I'm not saying we're outstanding, but we're on a journey.
Good. Okay, and then there are two things that I said very early on in terms of this session. I think, Julian, you said, actually, the figures might be going down, but we don't know why, which I think is quite...
It's all down to great policing. I wish I could say that, but I can't, or partnership working.
But equally, I was taken by something that Andy said. I've gone to a meeting, there is the public, there's all sorts of mayhem and misery going on, and actually the public are not recording it. So when we go back in terms of some of the realities of those issues, if I make the calls, because there's other bits of the Met that need to come into play, isn't it? It's like our hierarchy, and it's a bit like silo working. So if I make the calls on the 999 and they look me over to 101 or what, how far, in terms of our training and mission, that we are picking up people's issues of antisocial behaviour and then not being left off, or the feeling is people give up, or on the grapevine, which isn't always right, that actually no one's interested in officialdom about what is seen as a minor problem.
Yeah, I mean, the call handlers, whether it's 999 or 101, are trained. They will make a record on, and then eventually it will get onto the airspace system and be dealt with by the ward officers. It's possible that one incident, as Nick was saying, sometimes it's small components can create a big picture, and that's why the information needs to be joined up. So an individual call of a relatively minor nature, it is possible that the significance of it wouldn't be appreciated at the time, but hopefully it would be when they start looking at repeat calls, etc.
And it's getting that follow-up of once those initial calls of how we respond to the public, which will obviously do us great favours, including we're going to get onto partnership working later on, how we respond to people, either to reassure them that actually we understand what's going on and something is likely to happen, or if we can't resolve it. One-off incidences are interesting. I'd like to think we could resolve that. It's the high level of repeat, and quite frankly, the high level of repeat is becoming quite large in terms of casework that you're dealing with. Yeah. That's what I get across.
I mean, it creates a big demand on us. So I mean, there must be an issue for the person who's calling, whether it's legitimate calls or not. So we need to engage. Those of you that are going to Tower Hamlets later, do ask specifically, because there's some quite astonishing interventions. They took their top 10 callers. People maybe called 50 times over a period. And the graph just shows when they put their intervention measures in, it absolutely bottoms out and drops out, which is...
So response is key. Response is key to whatever is doing it, whether it's partnership working or the police is, in terms of dealing with these issues. That it's key to. It's key to resolving.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Let's just... lastly, I suppose, in terms of... let's go back to the attitudinal and cultural thing within the Met, and particularly on drug-related issues around antisocial behaviour, all right? So we've got the local resource doing its bit. I've got a group standing on a corner of, 20, 30, at various times it gets bigger at different hours of the day. They're not really acting out, but it's a pretty uncomfortable environment. And actually, a few people, visitors, cause the acting out that frighten my family. I'm on to you, it carries on and on. When it gets pushed up into the system, right?
I mean, that's exactly the sort of scenario that I want ward officers to deal with, because those do affect quality of life. It's not just the illegality of the drug dealing, but as you described it, it affects people's quality of life. That's exactly what I want them to do.
But do they sufficiently get the backup within Team Met, within their borough resources, to deal with issues like that?
The situation you described, if there's 30 people causing an issue on a ward, that's beyond the capability of those particular... Yes, they would need assistance from within the borough or beyond.
Okay. I think we need to work harder at that, because I don't think those officers feel there is sufficient backup in raising it, and the level of threat, the risk assessment of dealing with issues like that are just not quite there. But we might want to return to that, Chair, in terms of where it is. Can we go to partnership working now? And so I think we'll still start with MOPAC first. So how will the Mayor, what's new about this mayoral administration in terms of its work with local authorities, housing providers and other agencies to strengthen London's local response to antisocial behaviour?
So what we've done is actually reviewed and refined some of our partnership working and governance structures around this, and broadened out some of those partnership meetings. And we have the London Crime Reduction Board, that still exists. It's refocused its work so that it's aligned to the things that we've committed to deliver through the Police and Crime Plan, and that work we do with partners. And those partners are also engaged in that structure. There are a number of groups that sit beneath that look at specific things like reducing reoffending, etc. And those boards are actually quite broad in their membership. So the Violence Against Women and Girls, for instance, has some work that it does with housing providers. So where necessary and appropriate, we are bringing in wider partners, and we do quite a lot of work actually with the health sector, which is where we've been talking about the question about thresholds and how you get people into those services. So I think that what we've done is broadened out those partnership functions. I think in the over the last few years, actually, we've established ourselves as having a strong role in convening partners and bringing people together. I think local partners recognise that and appreciate that we can do that in a way that sometimes they can't. So we use that where we can, actually, to support local work quite effectively, I would suggest.
Local government partners, do you want to comment on that?
I don't know that I have much to add. I mean, I think the policing and crime plan is helpful, you know, in a couple of areas. I think the emphasis on vulnerability is clearly, you know, a good one for us. You know, we've talked a lot about vulnerability and victims this morning. So I think the emphasis on that is good, and I think the you know, the emphasis on dedicated ward officers that we've heard is a really positive move for this particular area as well. I think getting to the heart of those community issues is crucial, and we have many good examples where we've got great dedicated ward officers who have been instrumental in sorting out some really difficult problems in partnership and taking that local lead. So for us, that's a positive, and if we can avoid you know, if we can keep those consistent and avoid you know, abstractions and things like that, and you know, and have that bottom-up approach, I think that will be really good. I suppose the one area for me that we haven't covered where there are further opportunities is maybe through the ward panels, and really making sure that we're getting the most out of those. We have some great ones. We have some that are not functioning as well as they could. And I think if they're functioning well, you know, they're a really powerful tool for that community engagement, and you know, a way to you know, flag up issues, making sure that the local authority and the other partners are engaged in that. So, yeah.
Okay.
In terms of repeat callers, we do a lot of targeted work around repeat callers, and our crime analyst will look at all of the calls coming in, and we also work with the London ambulance service quite a lot around repeat callers and vulnerabilities. So he'll scan all of the calls, and that will be what develops our hotspots, and we'll look in there for perpetrators, places and vulnerable people. And so then we proactively go and engage with those. We send those out to our local joint action groups to be worked on by the police and the multi-agency. And I do think with repeat callers, it runs very similarly to children who experience neglect, you know, and that's like the neglect of ASB is the repeat callers, the ones that have got reporting fatigue and things. So we very much like to target that in any way that we can and get to the bottom of it, really. So I would say that that's how we work around the repeat callers.
Okay. Lee, is there any comment you want to make?
I think it's good there's a focus on partnership working now, because I think in the future it's going to become even more vital. I think a lot of people feel, generally if you ask a lot of people, they feel that antisocial behaviour is rising, the stats are showing it's reducing. I think what's actually happened is the nature of the antisocial, in our experience, it's been the nature of the behaviour that's changed. The gap between sort of traditional antisocial behaviour and more serious crime is closing. The response to challenge is changing, the numbers in groups. So what we're finding is we used to find lots of little groups doing silly things like, you know, a little bit of noise or a little bit of underage drinking. What we're now seeing is it's a group of 30, and actually it's downtime between other activities, perhaps, you know, moped-enabled crime or something like that, and it's that return to their estate before going back out again. So I think for us, what we're finding is we've always had a very strong partnership, working practices in all the areas that we work, But now it's becoming more vital because there's a lot less we can do independently, especially operational on the ground.
And I suppose one of the issues, just listening to the evidence we've had in the past and over the years, the fragmentation of some of the housing issues. I'm not saying all antisocial behaviour takes place on council estates. That's not true. It takes place throughout our boroughs in whatever areas. But in terms of dealing with those housing providers, well, I suppose it's an honest question about partnerships. Look, if one of your partners is not performing in the way that you want to perform, can you have that honest conversation around, actually, you're not doing your bit and you need to do your bit because we can't tolerate or carry on part of that prevent thing. I think you said, Andy, at one stage, we can't carry on with the situation because it's only just going to get worse and worse. And bringing people to play. Do you think you've sufficiently got the power or the arrangements in your partnership working that allows for those conversations to take place to say, come on, we need something more here?
I'd say the processes and the arrangements are there, but it is an issue. You know, I hear from my neighbourhood inspectors exactly those issues playing out and the frustrations they have in holding other agencies sometimes to account and getting those actions done. Something like the community risk map is a good model because it enables it to happen. But there's other times when when definitely they are going above and beyond that and asking the borough commanders effectively to have their conversations at a sort of chief exec level to try and get these things happen. But you know, the build up to that might have taken a month or 2 months, which is far too long for a victim.
Yeah. But it does take time. And is that the same sufficiently within local authorities that you can escalate up if you feel that one of the partners or some of the partners are not playing, are not coming to the table in the way that you could in resolving some of your problems that may be arising?
I think there are some blockages there, definitely. You know, we have got good working partnerships, but there are definitely some blockages and some challenges. But we do face the challenges head on, and but I would like to see further improvement there.
And in some of the blockages, sorry, Natasha, I'll bring you in. In some of the blockages are partly caused by because people don't understand their role of what they can do in contributing, making things better, or they just don't see it as their responsibility.
I think a lot of it's to do with safeguarding their budgets. Yeah. In all honesty. You know, and having access to people at the right level, you know, when you need to solve a problem. You know, it may be many steps down that you're dealing with, when really they don't have the power or authority to do what you need them to do in the time frame that you need it to be done. And so that's where the difficulty is. I try to overcome this by doing a cost-benefit analysis on most of our cases. Yeah. Retrospectively, you know, where they haven't played ball, and then I present that and say, this is what we did before, you know, this is the route you chose to go down, you know, that is a cycle, you've done it before, this was the outcome and it's still the same, this is what we suggested, and this is the cost of the two models, you know, and once we overcome that, then they tend to come to the table more.
It seems to us on the committee, in terms of our conversations we ever have, I mean, we can either continue along more the same or a shrug of the shoulders, this is life and life is difficult. So for all your successes that you have, I suspect every borough will have 5 cases that are outstanding and they're just not going anywhere and everyone's getting frustrated. And while those 5 cases are getting longer and longer not dealt with, we've got another 10 coming through the door on whatever the periodical issues. Mopac, what role do you, in terms of really emphasising, if we know that response works for everybody, and we know there's an element of prevention around the nature of this antisocial behaviour work and getting that response right, how do we overcome that particular problem, some of these barriers that work across all our part? You know, consistency is not our watchword, whatever we may like to say, even with procedures, you know, about some of the responses that we get. So what's Mopac's role?
I think I think there are a number of things, and I'd echo some of what colleagues have said. I think for us, partly people do see us as a body to which they can elevate issues. And certainly when we went out through the police and crime plan consultation, things were coming up through those discussions where people were telling us, well, at the local level, we've been trying to do this for ages and it's just not working. So we were able to take some of those things away and actually sort of make some higher level representations to get some things moving. So I think that people now see us in a space where we can do that, and we do that with them and for them. I think also other partners, in terms of our convening power, even where we don't necessarily have any authority over them, as such, to hold them to account, recognise the value that we can bring and will come to the table if we ask them to. So, you know, if we think about, you know, health partners, for instance, we don't have any jurisdiction over them, but they are quite well engaged in the work that we're trying to do, and we have some, you know, improving routes into those organisations, which helps us at our level, but also can help at the local level too, I think. I think one of the things that's really important in this space is about being able to show people that evidence base. So the data is important, and we use that a lot in terms of the crime data, but we've talked a lot about the picture not being, you know, entirely just about crime. There's other data that we can bring into these conversations to evidence to people why they should be doing certain things and actually making that cost-benefit argument. And that's been quite powerful in lots of ways. We've done that quite a lot in terms of some of our relationships with other criminal justice agencies, for instance, in terms of being able to demonstrate that if you do this, it will have, you know, actually a direct benefit to what you're trying to do or what you're trying to achieve. And then actually they can understand why it is you're asking them to do it, and will get on board. So I think that is really quite a powerful way of doing that.
Okay. I think that's it, Chair. I mean, we might want to follow up with some further written questions around those, but I think I've exhausted them.
Yeah, I mean, probably a last question really to the borough representatives, and we've heard the work with MOPAC and the Met, but is there anything, and it's the perennial question I always tend to ask, is there anything more, that, particularly from the boroughs and also Lead, that you would like the Mayor or MOPAC to do in addition to what we've heard about today?
I do think with the training aspect that got mentioned, that is quite key, because I think the problem we had is that when this all started, you had people who were implementing it, and you had people who were going to be enforcing it, and the training was very mismatched, especially externally. So there could be a standardised package on that would be a lot better.
Thank you. Andy, anything?
Nothing further to add, I think, other than what we've talked about from there.
Okay. Shirley?
No, I don't have anything to add at this stage.
But it's been very thorough. I mean, I'd certainly agree with some of the recent comments about walled panels. I'm a great advocate of walled panels. I think they're when properly constituted and properly representative, I think they're very strong, but they do need the support which we've already talked about. And I think the housing partners particularly, often the only sanction that some families and people will listen to is their domicility. And if they are under threat because of the behaviour of their children, sometimes that's the only thing that will actually bring them to the table. And I think that's really important. So again, I thank you very much for your work today. We will, if we need to, we're right for further evidence. We'll be putting this all together over the coming weeks, and we shall copy that to you and publish some work around that. Just one or two final actions. First of all, can I ask the committee to note the report around this, and also delegate authority to me to agree the output from our scrutiny investigation, which clearly I'll do in consultation with group leads and Caroline. Item 6, Police and Crime Committee work programme. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme, note the round-table discussion with Safe Neighbourhood Balls, which I referred to earlier, note that members attended the site visit to Notting Hill, and also delegate to me, with consultation with group leads and Caroline, to agree the committee's response to MOPAC and the Met's Public Service Access and Engagement Strategy consultation, connected to which I'm probably minded, and I think I've got the appetite of the group, to write to the Mayor around some disappointment around the, and I will talk about this later if needs be, around the advertising of the engagement events. These are massively important. There are borough events, and my understanding, and this is just anecdotal, and I will get further evidence if needs, is that many people in the boroughs and key people haven't really had proper notice and understanding of that. And there's I think that people are nodding, so it's likely that we'll be drafting a letter around that. Natasha's writing furiously and noting that. So, date of next meeting I have Wednesday the 20th of September, when we have the Mayor here, which will be good, 10 o'clock in the morning. I have no other urgent business. Thank you, guests. Right.